So I haven't made a video about morality in quite a long time, but I just watched an interesting video by Conference Reports, who was using a kind of evolutionary account of morality to undermine a theistic argument for objective morality, because objective morality would seem to imply a sort of absolute, unchanging, and static moral law. Whereas when we look at and observe um, the natural world around us, it would appear that there's a sort of historical process unfolding um, where each historical age, each socio-cultural and political, economic milieu, each generation has its own, sometimes radically different conception of morality and common sense way of relating to one's ethical responsibilities and freedoms. And I think, of course, Conference Report is right. It's hard to hold a quote objective morality given the facts of biological and cultural evolution. Um, but on the other hand, I wouldn't necessarily want to construe a quote religious morality as necessarily objective in the sense that some theists would claim. Um, Rather, I think, well, there's two ways of approaching this. We can look at the evolutionist model as not so much as a purely scientific fact which we have discovered objectively, but rather evolution is a cultural idea, a scientific idea, but also a cultural idea which emerged in the context of a particular social and political situation. Darwin living as a very wealthy person at the height of the British colonial empire was turning to the relationships among organisms in the natural world through the lens of Thomas Malthus's economic theory, capitalist economic theory, or rather Adam Smith's capitalist economic theory and Thomas Malthus's understanding of supply and demand uh, with, within a necessarily agricultural and mercantile and increasingly industrial um, society. So Darwin wasn't just looking at nature through this pure, um, a or non-cultural um, lens. He was caught up in a particular cultural milieu that led him to observe nature as, red tooth and claw, as a sort of competitive struggle for existence with a sort of fixed background environment of natural conditions, which would then passively select the organisms that happen to be most fit, sort of on accident. Um, so we have to look at Darwin's theory of evolution in a cultural context, right? And when we do that, our understanding of evolution as, at least of cultural evolution, as this kind of progression, you get this in Dawkins, a strange about face in his assessment of the teleological purpose of reality, where though the non-human biological world evolves through the mere um, accidental or purposeless selection of genetic replicators, as soon as these replicators stumble into the human form, something new emerges, a kind of mind or mimetic engine um, that can then rebel against its selfish genes, and the human can rise through the course of its cultural history to a freer and um, more good way of life. This is the kind of neoliberalist, techno-capitalist, utopian dream of progress that has guided the whole Enlightenment project. Um, and as someone critical of that project, I would want to invoke not an anti-evolutionary narrative, but a kind of denaturalization of what we call nature as opposed to culture. So I would want to read evolution both in its natural sort of cosmic form and in its human cultural form. Um, I would want to see it as both uh, progressive and regressive, you know, and not unambiguously a march toward greatness, but a kind of more of a steady state creative continuum where, yeah, morality is always changing, but morality is no mere accidental um, achievement either. It is rather, it becomes more of an aesthetic thing, uh, more a matter of intensifying the beauty uh, and the complexity, the complex unity of experience and existence than it is an attempt to master it, um, to transcend it and overcome it. So I think when we talk about morality, we can think of it either in terms of a kind of self-mastery, which is therefore also a mastery over the other, an enslavement of the other, or we could think of morality maybe more integrally, that such that it doesn't begin with the self and my desire to protect myself, or my sense of duty to protect the other. Rather, we can have an ethics that begins with the other, with the incompleteness of the self and the sort of um, brokenness when taken as a separate individual. In that ethics is coming to understand that to heal the brokenness of the self, relationships with others are necessary, and that it is only really through cultivating those relationships that a sense of self can come to emerge. Um, and so rather than talking about subjective or objective morality, we could talk about self-directed versus other-directed, you know, uh, moralities. And when I think about the evolution of our universe, with its experiential and its physical aspects, um, I see not a march toward mastery, but an increasingly internally uh, interrelated choreography, an orchestra of always multiplying instruments which reproduce one another but not identically. There's a reproduction of difference which leads to the introduction of novelty and this indeed evolutionary progression. Um, but we shouldn't mistake it for uh, what the capitalist orientation or attitude would mistake it for, as a competition between separate bodies. It's much more a mutually indwelling co-relation, or cooperation between internally related bodies. In other words, bodies with souls, not each their own, but shared souls, group souls. Soul is a communal thing, right? Just as knowing the good is something that we discover together, never simply objectively, but also not subjectively. So there's some meandering thoughts on morality for you.